Dive into what happens when two of the world's biggest democracies find themselves in a sudden, high-stakes trade standoff. We're talking about India and the United States, and believe me, this isn't just a minor squabble, it's a serious escalation, and the ripple effects could be felt across the entire global economy.
And it really all kicked off with some incredibly blunt language. This quote from the White House basically set the entire tone. It framed India's trade practices as fundamentally unfair, and, it really laid the groundwork for everything that was about to happen. This was less a quiet policy shift and more of a very loud public challenge.
And what happened next? Well, it came down to this number. The administration jacked up tariffs on a whole range of Indian goods to as high as 50%. I mean, that is a massive leap, and it was designed to put immediate and pretty painful pressure on Indian exporters.
Okay, but to really get what's going on here, we have to pull back a bit and look at the foundation. Because all this sudden friction, it's happening inside a really deep and historically very resilient economic partnership. It's a relationship that's been growing for decades. But, and this is a big but, it's also been pretty imbalanced for a while.
The scale of that growth is just staggering. I mean, look at this. In just 15 years, trade between the two countries absolutely exploded, going from around $12 billion to over $60 billion. That's a clear sign of just how deeply interconnected these two economies have become.
But here's the catch. That growth was not a two-way street. This chart shows what we call India's trade surplus with the U.S. That's the amount by which its exports were bigger than its imports. And this gap, which from the U.S. perspective is a trade deficit, it wasn't getting smaller, it was getting wider and wider. And that is the number at the heart of Washington's frustration.
So let's just make sure we're all on the same page. A trade surplus for India just means it's selling more stuff to the US than it's buying. Simple enough. But flip that around, and from the American point of view, that very same gap is called a trade deficit. And that deficit number is what's been driving so much of the political heat.
But here's where the story gets way more complex. This whole tariff fight, it's not just about balancing the books. The trade deficit numbers are really being used as a tool, as leverage for a much bigger geopolitical game. We're talking about strategic pressure. So what's really driving all this? Well, the trade deficit is the official reason, sure, but it's also a lever to achieve other goals. The unofficial list? Pushing India on its defense and energy ties with Russia, trying to force open its very protected agricultural markets, and getting India to buy more American energy and weapons. This is pure geoeconomics in action. In this table right here, this shows you exactly why a deal has been so hard to reach. The US wants almost zero tariffs and completely open access for its agriculture. But for India, protecting its millions of small-scale farmers and guaranteeing its own food supply, those are absolute red lines. Same goes for its right to decide where it buys its own defense and energy from.
So with both sides pretty much at a standstill, who actually ends up paying the price for all these tariffs? Well, like in any trade war, the answer is, it's complicated. The impact just ripples right through businesses, supply chains, and all the way down to you and me, the consumers in both countries.
For India, you can see the pain is really concentrated in these key labor-intensive sectors. We're talking textiles, gems and jewelry, auto parts. These are industries that employ millions and millions of people, a lot of them in smaller businesses, that just can't absorb a 50% tariff hit overnight.
But make no mistake, this is a double-edged sword. While India's economy could take a real GDP hit, it's American consumers who start seeing higher prices on store shelves. Critical supply chains get all tangled up and, finding a new supplier for these goods isn't always quick or cheap. At the end of the day, a tariff is a tax, and someone always pays it.
And while all this economic pressure was building, the rhetoric got just as intense. This particular line was used to justify the aggressive moves, trying to paint India's economy as some kind of stagnant, closed-off system.
But does that story actually hold up to the facts? Well, let's look at a number. This one. That's the year-over-year growth of made-in-India smartphones being imported directly into the United States. A 240% increase? That hardly sounds like a dead economy, does it?
And this chart puts it in even starker relief. Not that long ago, in the second quarter of 2024, India supplied about 13% of the smartphones coming into the US. Today, that number is up to 44%. So while the political talk is one thing, the reality on the ground is that American consumers are actually becoming more reliant on Indian manufacturing, not less.
So, you might think that with all this pressure, India would just fire back with its own tariffs in a tit-for-tat war.
But that's not what's happening. Instead, India is playing a much longer, more calculated game. It's all about building long-term resilience.
So what does that game plan actually look like? I mean, how do you counter this kind of immense pressure without escalating a trade war that could hurt everyone? Well, the answer seems to be a very clear three-part strategy. Here's the playbook. First, keep the lines of communication open. India is choosing dialogue over direct retaliation. Second, don't put all your eggs in one basket. They're speeding up trade deals with other major partners like the EU and the UK. And third, double down on making your own economy stronger, boosting domestic manufacturing to be more competitive globally.
Now, this entire approach, it's all guided by this one core principle of Indian foreign policy: strategic autonomy. It's basically the idea that India needs to be able to make its own decisions on trade, on defense, on energy, based on what's best for India, without being pushed into a corner by any other country.
And that, right there, is the key takeaway. India's response isn't a knee-jerk reaction. It is a deliberate, long-term strategy. The goal isn't just to punish the U.S. with counter tariffs, but to build an economy that's strong enough to handle these kinds of shocks in the future, no matter where they come from.
Which leaves us with this final massive question. Is what we're seeing just a temporary trade spat between friends? Or is this the new reality of how international relationships work? Can strategic allies actually challenge each other this aggressively on trade without completely breaking the partnership? That right there is the multi-billion-dollar question.